For me, the myth about money, and I think why MMT has been so important, is that it tells us how money is actually created and that it comes from states. It doesn't come from tax receipts. That idea that we need to get the growth first, to get the taxes first, keeps us locked in this kind of continual feedback loop. If you think that we first of all need to get the growth in order to get the taxes and to get the jobs, we're then going to prioritise policies that we think are going to give us the growth first.
This is the MMT Podcast with Patricia and Christian Riley. Hi, I'm Christian Riley and welcome to the Modern Monetary Theory Podcast. You can find us on Twitter at MMT Podcast, and you can support the show by going to patreon.com/MMT Podcast. If this is your first time hearing about MMT, you might want to listen to our first 3 episodes for an introduction, which I've linked to in the show notes, along with some other things that relate to this particular episode. And as ever, I've linked to where you can support this podcast financially via patreon.com/MMT Podcast. Support starts at $1 a month or £1 a month or whatever the equivalent is wherever you live. We're 100% listener funded. Your financial support really helps keep the show going, and your support in other ways, whether it's by recommending us to other people or just by listening and spreading the word about this stuff, really helps too. A big thank you to all of our supporters so far, and thanks as ever for the time you put into understanding MMT. Let's dive in. Welcome one and all to the MMT Podcast. I'm Christian Riley.
And I'm Patricia Pina.
And we are delighted to be joined today by economist, writer, and critically acclaimed podcast creator, Katy Shields. Thanks so much for joining us today, Katy.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, Katy, you describe yourself as a recovering mainstream economist, which I really like. On that topic, you recently wrote an amazing 4-part series of essays entitled How Captured Economics Stole Our Climate and What We Can Do About It. And in one of those essays, you absolutely nail the problem with mainstream economics as it's taught today by getting the reader to imagine they've got a friend who's a severe workaholic. Could you lay that out for us?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I'll try. I think I'm probably not the first person to kind of make this analogy with our economy as kind of being like it's addicted. Some people say we're like a crack or heroin addict. We can't get off our addiction, in particular to economic growth. But what I was trying to do with this analogy is also help listeners or readers understand the role of mainstream economics, and particularly the discipline, so the academic economics within that. So yeah, for example, imagine you've got a friend who's a workaholic and they're basically working themselves sick. They're working themselves almost to death. And everyone around can see that what they need to do is they need to work less. They need to deal with this problem at its root cause. What I ask readers to imagine is then you go to the doctor, and instead of the doctor saying, take some time off, look after yourself, well-being, retreat, whatever, they say, no, actually, fine, keep going, work some more. Here are some performance-enhancing drugs. Actually, earn some more, because do you know what? If you earn some more, in future, there might be this even better drug that's coming along. And so I guess what I'm trying to say, and I know it's a little bit of a ridiculous example, and obviously to be clear, I know that the medical profession does not do that. But if we imagine economists, and this is where I feel it gets quite serious, as the medical profession of the economy, right? It's their job to understand how our economy functions and produce advice that can help it to function healthily for the long term in our interest, in the interest of the common good, then they're effectively not doing that job properly, because they are actually doing, like the ridiculous story in my essays, they are saying, no, keep going. We can just medicate ourselves out of it. We can keep doing the same thing over and over again. And not only that, when you get, and I describe them as heterodox medical professionals, a small group on the outside, a small group saying, well, actually, we've got some evidence to suggest we can't keep doing this. You are going to work yourself to death. But even better, we've got some potential solutions that don't require those speculative medicines that could get you out of this problem. The orthodox, the mainstream doctors or the economists say, no, They're nonsense. Forget what they're saying. We are the mainstream. Listen to us and don't listen to that group on the outside, even if they have useful things to say. And that is really the point I'm trying to make with these essays, is that for too long now, I would argue, the mainstream, the orthodox economists have been monopolizing economics and not listening to other voices that have potentially better solutions for our crises.
It's interesting that you choose the medical profession as a comparison, but wouldn't you say that, the main issue there is that whereas doctors would be held to account for the health outcomes of their patients, in economics, economists are pretty much self-regulated, and we never hold economists to account for bad outcomes. How would you even begin to do that? Or have they got the wrong incentives?
Yeah, so we're kind of getting into some of the kind of another point of my essays that I'm trying to put forward is, okay, based on this understanding, what is the system, right, that keeps kind of this orthodoxy, this mainstream in place? And you're right, like Patricia, one of them is there is no accountability. There is no sort of ethics board. There isn't even kind of an agreement on that and somehow integrating ethics into economics. There have been suggestions in the past. Kate Rayworth, Yayati Ghosh, some of the heterodox economists that I mentioned in my essays have talked about this, have said, why don't we have a Hippocratic oath? And so, yeah, ethics and accountability and checks and balances are a big part of this. I don't have, let's say, the solution. And I should also add that my essays are an exploration, and I want to go further with this research. So my intention was to create a documentary series out of these essays. And I would love to hear more suggestions on that. But I think absolutely it's a big missing part of the puzzle.
To give you an example, in the engineering profession, we've got a code of conduct. And one of the first points within that code of conduct is you have to act in the interest of society. Of course, there can be disagreement as to what that means exactly, but at least you need to prove that the intention to do that is there. And as far as I know, economists don't have anything like that.
In your essay series, Katy, you've been a professional economist now for 20 years, if I read you right. But you write about how right back at the beginning, when you were a student, starting in the second year of your economics degree, you were feeling that the theories are becoming more and more abstract. Can you remember anything in particular that started to ring alarm bells?
Yeah, and it is going back, but I was trying to dredge some of these memories up for my essays. I should say that, maybe just to clarify, I've been a professional, so private sector economist, but not an academic economist. And economists, if there are any economists listening to this, particularly in the mainstream, might say, well, to be an economist, you have to have a PhD or a postdoc and so on. But yeah, I've been working in the private sector, economic consulting and economic research, and now economic education for over 2 decades. Which, yeah, so then it begs the question, if I found it so abstract, why did I stay? But to be honest, I didn't have any point of reference. I think that's one of the things I should say. And I think that's an issue in economics generally. If you go into economics, you're just kind of presented with these theories. And it starts out kind of reasonable enough, supply and demand, markets, inflation, interest rates, and so on. But what I was finding as we went on is it starts to get quite mathematical quite quickly, but a particular kind of mathematical way of viewing the world, a very, what I would say, a reductionist linear view of the world. So kind of every problem that is presented, you're always kind of presented with this classic chart, this X and Y axis of two variables, whether it's employment and inflation or investment and interest rates or growth and trade. And it seems just also very boring. And it wasn't until actually at the end of my degree, and I mentioned this as well, there's been some research done on this of different kinds of economic students. And many economic students are there basically because economics is part of a broader degree. And for me, it was part of a business degree. So I was expecting I would do these classes in economics and maybe go on and work in a corporation or work in consulting, which is eventually what I ended up doing. So I was kind of, I would say I was almost starting to check out. And then when I got to my final year, I took a class in development economics, which was actually not included in the business school program, but elsewhere at the university. And it was not sort of so radical, because unfortunately development economics is also fairly mainstream, but it did ask me to kind of question some of the fundamentals. And it started to bring in topics like politics and power.
Do you think that those things might have an impact on the way we produce and consume and distribute things?
Right. But in economics and the way that it's taught, it's kind of like you have to get through all the basics first. You have to learn all the linear reductionist models. And then at the end, you're presented with these other things that might potentially shift things as if it's kind of an add-on. But really, and now, and we can get into this more from a heterodox perspective, that's where you start. You start with the political economy, you start with the culture, you start with the history. I remember specifically one lecture in which I think I'd just checked out, I don't know, I was probably hungover. And my professor was going on and on about growth theories and endogenous growth theory and how growth begets growth and as economies and innovation. And I was thinking, what did I miss the lecture and where we talked about where growth comes from? What is the origin of this growth? And I felt then so stupid because I clearly hadn't been paying attention and it was very abstract and I was just kind of doing my exams to get through the degree. And it wasn't until later. So in development economics, I started to get this sense, okay, well, there's this colonial history there. There's reasons why countries are trapped in poverty. And then much later on, then when I discovered things like ecological economics, then starting to realize, okay, growth actually comes from the agricultural surplus, the resources, the energy, right? That nature is the basis of all this growth. But that doesn't enter into the mainstream at all. We're just simply not asked to think about it. Growth sort of emerges. There's no political forces and there's certainly no natural forces shaping it.
When I was doing my master's, the first thing I read about, and admittedly I did it much later than you did, so I would have been familiar with MMT before I did it. But one of the things that really caught my attention was that in I think it's the Mankiv textbook, which is a common textbook, I think it's Macroeconomics by Mankiv. One of the first or second pages says, everybody knows the market is the best way to allocate resources. And it's a statement of ideology, which is quite rare, to be honest, in textbooks, which is good, but it wasn't presenting it as if it was ideology. It was presenting it as a matter of fact and basically stating that whatever socialist or collectivist attempts that had been in the past had all failed. Therefore, market is best. Let's move on.
But then when they move on, they don't go to the next question, which would be, okay, even if you think that the markets are the best, are they naturally occurring or not? Are they constructs? Are they malleable? So Katy, you write, by the time you'd graduated, you'd internalized this idea that only economic growth could solve the challenges we're faced with, like poverty and famine and climate catastrophe, these trivial things. Only growth could solve these things in your mind back then as a graduate. If 2025 Katy could go back in time and meet undergraduate Katy, what would you tell her?
Well, I think I would honestly have probably said, go do something else. Read The Limits to Growth. We might come to that, which for me was a really eye-opening book. Learn systems thinking. And I think also think about economies are shaped, like you said, they're shaped by politics, they're shaped by culture. I loved when I was at school, in fact, I was even thinking about this, I would go as far to say, and this brings up to the sort of the Gregory Mankiw book, I would go as far to say that I was probably less smart when I left university. Because at high school, I was doing interdisciplinary work. I loved writing, I loved art, I loved politics. I was doing a lot of critical thinking. And you're not asked to think critically when you're learning mainstream or orthodox economics. You know, the Gregory Mankiw textbook, here are the fundamental 10 ways to think like an economist. So I would have probably said continue with the arts, but do something interdisciplinary, do a liberal arts degree or something, understand how systems work, understand how our economies work, and then think of ways to use arts, culture, media, like what you're doing here as well, to try to change the narrative. Because that's, I'm getting into systems thinking, that's the fundamental highest point of leverage, is to change how we understand the world. And economists are trying to tell us, you know, a generation of people, that the world works in one way and it just doesn't.
So as you say, Katy, these days you're a recovering mainstream economist. And you also say that you only felt you truly understood how the economy worked after you read The Limits to Growth, which you touched on just now. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so I discovered The Limits to Growth in 2017, I think it was. I was at a summer academy organised by the Club of Rome, which is the think tank which sponsored the publication of the study that became the book The Limits to Growth. So this was a study by a group of interdisciplinary scientists in MIT in the early 70s. And it was really a first attempt, I would argue a first attempt to model the full human economy. They were tasked with trying to solve what they termed the problematique, this interconnected kind of nest of critical problems that were constantly reoccurring. So problems like poverty, hunger, crime, pollution, resource extraction. And so what this team of scientists had done, and they were working in this field which was really just emerging. It was founded by an engineer called Jay Forrester of systems dynamics, trying to understand the dynamic forces shaping our societies and our economies. And so they built a model where they actually integrated the fundamental working parts of our economies. So they had resources, they had food, they had industrial production, they had human health, human population, and then they had pollution. And what they did was they looked at how they all interacted with each other, and they came to the conclusion, by working out these interconnections, by working out how these factors are related over time, that if we continue on the path of the 1970s of this very exponential growth in the industrial economy, exponential growth in pollution, that we would eventually, sometime during this century, reach those limits to growth, reach the capacity of the earth to sustain life in a stable way, and that we would start to run into problems. We would start to run into problems with our ability effectively to feed ourselves, because we would degrade the environment so much that we would be unable to produce enough food, and that we would also impact our human health. And so there's this famous chart called the Standard Run, where you see these lines all growing exponentially: food, industrial production, but also pollution and population. And then around about the middle of this century, they start to drop off and we see this collapse. They didn't know when it would exactly occur. It wasn't a projection, it was scenarios, and they had other scenarios, but they found that the only scenario that would enable us to avoid such an outcome would be to find a way to manage our economy within the capacity of the earth to sustain life. So it wasn't sort of, at that time, they weren't even talking about things like degrowth, because we still had time. We hadn't gone over the planetary boundaries. We were still within the Earth's carrying capacity, but we were running up against certain limits. There were a lot of problems that were emerging, from lead poisoning to DDT, acid rain. Climate change was starting to be talked about, so greenhouse gases were starting to be talked about. So there was kind of a consensus that we ought to figure out where those limits are and try to work within them. And I was just totally shocked when I read this book, because I'd never heard of it. It's absolutely not talked about when you study economics, even though it really is, in my opinion, this kind of very complete picture of the economy. And so that sort of sent me down a rabbit hole to understand why I had not known about it. I mean, I had even gone on after my bachelor's. Later on, I returned to university and did a master's in environmental economics. And I still didn't encounter the limits to growth. And then I later found out that economists had been particularly critical of it, and had eventually ensured that it would sort of be thrown into the kind of dustbin of history and kind of laughed at. And that was those doomsayers back there in the 70s, and look how wrong they were. Things are going fantastic. That's kind of the narrative that you hear from economists even still today. And for me, this was just an eye-opener. This was an attempt to understand holistically how the economy works and the various forces affecting it. And it's very clear, maybe not to mainstream economists, but it's very clear to many other people that we are on that trajectory, and we ought to have listened to them. And we still kind of can take the lessons from that and try to understand our economy as embedded in nature, as embedded in society, and move towards something like what they were advising us to do, which is an economy within the planetary boundaries.
I'll just jump in here and say that you were so taken with the limits to growth that you did a fantastic 3-part podcast series about it called Tipping Point, the Real Story of the Limits to Growth. And we'll link to that in the show notes. In terms of the continued pushback on that, on the limits of growth, and the kind of counter arguments that are out there still today, in your essays, you've written about this idea of dematerialization. So that's the idea that we could keep growing GDP, but in a less material way, so we can have growth decoupled from emissions, so-called green growth. Can you talk about that and the issues with it?
Yeah, so the idea of dematerialization is essentially that we can kind of keep growing the GDP, which is basically everything that we produce and consume in a year, measured in money, that we can keep growing that while consistently reducing the environmental impact. And this is an idea that economists have been throwing around for decades, this idea of the so-called environmental Kuznets curve, where you start off with economies that are poor and have a relatively low material footprint. And then as they industrialize, that grows. But then you get to a point where we've kind of gone through the dirty industry and we get out on the other side and we get consistently cleaner. We use fewer resources. We can afford to clean up our environments. And we get to some, I guess, nirvana, some point down the road where we've got economies that are not using materials at all. This is obviously clearly not backed up by any science, because We do require materials for our economies. Even as we shift to a service industry, the service industry is growing. It is also tied to materials with the technology that we're using for this podcast or the AI that my Zoom account is trying to get me to sign up to. And even I mentioned just before the planetary boundaries work done by the Stockholm Resiliency Centre under Johan Rockström and that team of Earth system scientists. The first publication was in 2008. It's been continually updated. It shows that we've already gone beyond the material limits of our planet. So this idea that we can keep going, I mean, it just needs to be called out as categorically and factually, scientifically not true. I think that is the fundamental challenge that we have with economics, is that if mainstream or orthodox economics cannot agree or cannot accept that our economy is embedded in nature, you cannot separate it from nature, then that is, I think, where we sort of, and I also talk about this in my essays, where we just will continue to talk past each other because they simply just do not see it, they do not accept it. And I think that just needs to be called out more. We're beyond the limits. It's not that we can somehow have green growth and sort of reach a level there where we can sort of then stabilise at some point later in the future. We've gone beyond the limits. We need to materially degrow, and that we cannot do as long as we're trying to grow the GDP.
I just wanted to emphasize what you're saying there by pulling this quote out from your article as an example of how far away from reality the mainstream economists are. You note that William Nordhaus, who won the Swedish Banker Prize for his work on climate, or rather what climate change would do to GDP rather than what climate change would do to people. But anyway, he estimates the economic costs of reaching plus 3 degrees Celsius of warming by 2100 will be just 1.6% of GDP. And then you note, for comparison, you add the costs of the LA wildfires just so far in 2025 are estimated at 1% of US GDP. I mean, is there anything else to add, really?
Yeah, and obviously I try to go into that, and I know you've had people like Steve Keen who's put a lot of effort into kind of exposing the problems of Nordhaus's work, which unfortunately, because he was kind of left to it, and I think that's also kind of a part of it that I was maybe is helpful for people to understand, that within mainstream orthodox economics, because nature, because environment is seen as something out there extra, we'll get to it when we've got enough money to deal with it. It's a luxury. We've got more important things to deal with. That was the argument as well that was thrown at the authors of Limits to Growth. You know, you're these middle class ivory tower scientists, but hey, we're out here dealing with real problems. Forget about the environment. We'll deal with that later. That climate and environmental economics, which I also studied, is very much a niche within economics.
Yeah. We should just underscore that there's a difference between ecological economists and environmental economists, right? People make the mistake of thinking, oh, they're all doing the same thing, and they're absolutely not.
Absolutely. And I made the same mistake. So I was starting to be concerned with climate change in about 10 years or so ago. And I went back and did a master's, and I was taught environmental economics, climate economics, in the vein of William Nordhaus, who, as you've mentioned, had this cost-benefit analysis where you prioritise GDP. Most of the economy is not affected by climate change, according to William Nordhaus, because it takes place indoors, as if we don't need to feed ourselves indoors, and then comes up with this ridiculous number and is kind of accepted because, honestly, I think most other economists were like, at least someone is doing this. That's very nice. You have your niche thing. That's very good that someone cares about the environment and gets peer reviewed and gets out there and becomes essentially the blueprint, right, for climate economics, this type of modelling. And how many decades of time we've lost because of that doesn't bear thinking about.
And obviously you get the critique of Nordhaus from, say, Steve Keen and yourself, both using this thing that you touched on before, systems dynamics. And I know, Patricia, you had a question about system dynamics.
Well, I just wanted to know more about it. I think that sounds fascinating.
Yeah, sure. So systems dynamics is, maybe I should start with Jay Forrester. He said that we build systems models to improve our mental models of the world. So we all walk around with a kind of model of how the world works in our head. And the art, I guess, of systems dynamics is trying to put that onto paper. So a system is essentially, you can use systems dynamics for all sorts of problems. Jay Forrester actually started using it for companies to help them understand their networks and how to better manage things like inventories and sales and workers and incomes and debts and so on. And so a system is essentially a set of interrelated elements. So this is the way Janella Meadows defines it, that work together and have a common purpose. So the purpose of the company might be to produce certain goods, and the purpose of the economy right now in the way it's organised, you might say, is to produce economic growth. And so the work of systems dynamics is really looking at how things are connected, how they're related to each other over time. And there are a couple of core parts to that. They work very much, and I think this is where it's very different to economists who look at sort of correlations between things. How does GDP relate to emissions? Janella Meadows always said that systems thinkers and working with systems dynamics, you look for the root causes. And you look also for the effects, the feedback. So growing the economy might be good. You might get more money. That might enable you to invest, let's say, in healthcare or education. But some of that growth might also lead to, fast food, which might feed back and impact health. Some of it might lead to pollution, which might feed back and impact our ability to produce food, which will impact health, which will impact population. So it's about understanding how things are connected. And the dynamic part is also over time. You get certain effects that will take a long time to be seen and certain effects that happen very quickly. So what this original model with limits to growth was really trying to do was to work out various scenarios for how the human economy might develop over time and try to be able to preempt problems that were not necessarily noticeable in the 70s, but then because of phenomenons of exponential growth, compounding problems as climate changes, it's a compounding problem. The more CO2 you put into the atmosphere and the longer it stays, because it's a long-lived gas, at some point that will become an issue. And so the aim of this modelling is to be able to sort of perceive and preempt problems before they become so big that we then can't deal with them.
How is this fundamentally different from the modeling of choice of mainstream economics, which is econometrics?
The main tool of econometrics, and I've done a bit of it, it's been a while, is called the regression analysis, using historical data, historical trends to essentially forecast and predict the future.
So it's a statistical analysis, basically.
It's a statistical analysis. And this is also why Nordhaus was a huge critic of the limits to growth. It's another one of the reasons why it was kind of disregarded, is that it requires you then, of course, to have sufficient data over a sufficient time period in order to do that linear analysis, to find that line of best fit, that trend, and then use that to make the projection. And the problem is, with a lot of problems, as I was saying, like when you've got these problems that are slowly building up over time and then will suddenly become problematic, so you get that hockey stick curve, you can't do that kind of forecasting because you don't have the historical trend to prove it. So that's sort of one fundamental problem, is this relying on data that you can see. In fact, Janella Meadows wrote a wonderful book on this called Groping in the Dark, where she tries to explain the difference in these theories, because what they were trying to do with world modelling was essentially grope in the dark, try to figure out the problems that were coming down the road, that were in the pipeline, which you cannot purely by looking for empirical evidence of our last couple of years or decades or so figure out. So that's one element. And then the second is this difference between causes and trends, or causes and correlations. What Nordhaus is doing and what a lot of the decoupling literature is, and I mentioned another study which came out in Austria last year while we were based in Vienna in Austria, and we were organising the Beyond Growth conference, and a group of economists sponsored by the business lobbyists sort of tried to dispute what we were doing. And they did this regression analysis where they worked out that because GDP and CO2 were decoupling a little bit, we could decouple them a lot if we just grew GDP. And they came out with this ridiculous number, this 7% growth per year, which Austria hasn't seen in history and certainly can't do because we don't have the resources to do it. And that is the difference. So this linear reductionist approach of regression analysis, where you're looking at these two variables and you're not looking at what they are tethered to, is different to when you have systems dynamics, where they're trying to get the whole system and they're trying to get the entire structure of the economy. Once you have the structure there, if you were to simply add a resource constraint, if you were to add a labour constraint, if you were to add things like political will or culture, you very quickly see that you cannot get those growth rates, because you will immediately run into barriers. You will run into barriers on the resources, but you will also run into things like cultural barriers. People are not ready, I mentioned it in my essays, Austrians are not ready to give up their schnitzel yet. or their cars yet. Sorry, just another example that I really like, which Donella Meadows often referred to, was with the Montreal Protocol. She said it took 15 years for scientists to prove that we were causing a hole in the ozone layer. It took another 15 years to negotiate, to stop causing that hole. And then it took another 15 years after that for the hole to just begin to close. So that's 45 years from discovering the evidence to actually being able to solve it. And that is what the Limits to Growth was about, with these dynamics. And that's the absolute opposite approach that Nordhaus takes, where he says you grow first, and then suddenly at the last minute, we turn everything around because we're rich enough to do it. That's just simply not possible. It's just nonsense. Sorry, it just is.
We'll be right back after this message from our sponsor. Hey there, dear listener. Our sponsor for this episode of the MMT podcast is you, the listener, and we can't do it without you. And when I say it, I mean our aim to promote the best understanding that we can put together of how this thing called the economy actually works and how we can make it better. And we think a big part of that is knowing that better is possible and that many destructive policy choices are often sold to us by falsely equating the spending capacity of a government to that of a household. The way your government spends is nothing like the way a person or a household spends, because currency issuing governments are the source of their own spending money. Unemployment, underemployment, underfunded public health services, poverty, and many other things that politicians and pundits sell to us as sad but necessary are actually never necessary. Our money system has been mischaracterized in the media and academia for decades. An electorate that knows how it works can truly change things for the better and literally save lives. So we hope you can find it in your heart to support us via patreon.com/MMT podcast, because it really helps keep the show going and we want to make it bigger and better. So thanks as ever for the time you put into understanding MMT. Let's dive back in. I didn't want to miss this quote from you because I think it's really well put. This from the essay, quote, "Pretty much all core assumptions of what is typically termed mainstream economics center on the notion of economic efficiency, essentially extracting as much monetary value from something as possible. And since it is easiest to take and profit from that which has no voice, which cannot defend itself, nature, undocumented labor, future generations, costs are shoved onto those who are least deserving of the burden, while benefits are funneled to those who already have so much," end quote. And that's just to emphasize that mainstream economics actually might be fit for purpose if that purpose is the upward redistribution of wealth. But anyway, you counterpose the growth paradigm with an approach centered around a concept called sufficiency. Can you talk about that?
Yes, I can talk a little, and I would just emphasize there are a lot of people working on this. Also, many people that are more qualified to come in and talk on this if this is something you want to go into more. But it even appeared in the IPCC report, not in the summary for policymakers, the last one, but in the IPCC report. An economist, a French Algerian economist, Yamina Sahib, is kind of the expert in sufficiency. And I tend to take her definition, which is sufficiency policies are a set of measures and daily practices that avoid the demand for energy, materials, land and water while delivering human well-being for all within planetary boundaries.
And on the ground, for somebody living in an advanced economy, how would a policy approach informed by sufficiency impact them?
Well, I mean, the idea is that, and I think this is where then we have to then split, and thank you for the quote that I had about kind of the way our economies are organized right now. The basic economic literature, when you learn Economics 101, you're told that humans have unlimited wants and needs. And that is why we simply cannot have economies that stop growing, because apparently we are very greedy and selfish and we want more and more and more.
We're insatiable.
Yeah. And that is not held up by other social science, by certain behavioral sciences, by development economists like Max Neave and his theory of fundamental human needs. They all show that actually our needs are quite materially limited. And so we can fulfill our needs with much fewer resources. And in fact, we may be better off because it means that we would spend more time doing more fulfilling work, like culture, like creativity, like spending time with loved ones, spending time in nature. So it would certainly be a big cultural shift to move away from our materialistic lifestyle. But we saw in the COVID pandemic, and I think even more so in the United Kingdom, I noticed, than in other countries, because I guess, it has become a bit the neoliberal poster child, but the surveys were showing that people really enjoyed just not doing as much. And so, yeah, it's a big shift. And of course, the longer we leave it till we sort of start that cultural work of moving to a more sufficiency-oriented economy, obviously, the harder it is just to simply turn around. But we can certainly have good, fulfilling lives on a much, much smaller material footprint. And I'm sure we would all be healthier and happier for it.
Yeah. I mean, thinking about degrowth, it's sometimes hard to pitch, but something that resonated with me was something that Stephen Hale said to us a few interviews ago, which is, he said, degrowth will happen anyway. Degrowth will happen whatever you think about it, however you feel about it, as a catchy or not catchy slogan. So the question then becomes, do you want degrowth to happen the ugly way, or the way where we all get a dignified, socially inclusive life?
There's controlled degrowth or uncontrolled degrowth.
Yeah. So I was thinking, when we talk about degrowth, the next things out of our mouths should be universal public services and job guarantee, just to reassure people. Our idea is, no matter what happens to GDP, sacred GDP, anybody who can and wants to work will be able to work and earn the means to a decent life. And no matter what life throws at you, you'll always have a home. You'll always be able to heat that home.
But isn't that the main issue, Christian? Because you mentioned, Katy, that this kind of concern for the environment was perceived as a middle-class concern, which is far from what it actually is. But I think the reason why it sounds like that is because people associate growth with employment. And to ask people to embrace degrowth to somebody that doesn't understand what's really driving this and the theory behind it, it's like asking somebody to starve themselves to save the environment. And that kind of comes across as being kind of out of touch and all this. I know it's definitely not. But what do you think we can do to disassociate that kind of perception of employment and decent income, especially for those in the lower end of the income spectrum, is dependent on growth?
I'll just jump in there and say, it sounds like you're saying you have to content yourself with less as an individual. But really, if we go down the universal public services route, which we have to, right, in order to do it, it's about expanding public wealth so that most people do actually get more, more security, more peace of mind. That's just my suggestion.
Yeah. So, and again, this kind of comes back to systems thinking. Donella Meadows, and you might be aware of the famous kind of iceberg model. I use it a lot in my talks and my presentations. So the iceberg shows us that if you think of an iceberg, we often focus on the events. We focus on what's happening at the tip of the iceberg. We focus on climate change, pollution, unemployment, whatever. And we don't look underneath the iceberg to the actual structures that are holding the economy in place, our society in place, and that lead to those outcomes that we see above. But underneath the structures, and in order to be able to change structures, we need to work at the level of mental models, of narratives. So Donella Meadows always said, at the basis of the iceberg, at the very bottom, if you dive right down with your whatever your submarine is, that's where you'll find the mental models. That's where you'll find people's perceptions about the economy. And so things like, and I was giving a talk yesterday, and I was trying to explain this in Austria. So for example, we had the climate activists, the last generation, they were trying to convince the public to go for a 100 speed limit on the motorways, which is an extremely cheap and effective climate measure. And there are many countries that actually have a 100 speed limit. So we know it works and we know it doesn't really have an impact, although economists will come out and say you have a reduction in GDP and productivity, people can get to work faster. But actually a lot of studies show that it reduces traffic because traffic flows more smoothly. So you don't even have an economic impact. It's really, really cheap and effective to do. And there was no public support for it. And in fact, in the end, the whole movement disbanded. They were completely ineffective in this work and people actually even turned against them. And so what I was trying to explain is that Austria is very heavily tied to the German economy, and we're very reliant on the automotive industry for jobs and growth. So if your mental model is that, if your understanding of the economy, now we're back to Jay Forrester and the models that we carry around in our head are how we navigate the world. If your mental model in your head is Austria's economy is tied to cars, we cannot have a lower speed limit because that's going to impact the car industry. People are going to take the train because they're going to be worried about stuck in traffic. People are going to lose their jobs. I'm not going to vote for that. So then you won't get the structure. So as you move up the iceberg towards the level of the water, you get to the structure and how the economy is set up. And those structures in Austria are things like commuting is incentivized. You get money if you commute with your car. They've just increased the price for public transport. These are the structural things like speed limits. These are the structures of the economy that we need to change if we want to move to something more like a sufficiency economy. But we can't get there if we don't work at that narrative level. And so the work that you're doing here with this podcast and that I'm doing with my essays is trying to bring these ideas out to the public, trying to challenge the narratives that we need growth for jobs, that we need the private sector for jobs, that we can't organise ourselves in other ways. And of course, universal basic services is an important part of it, but there's also many other solutions that don't even require as much influence by states. There's local economies, there's the commons, there's all sorts of different ways that we might organise ourselves. And it's about challenging those narratives and showing what alternatives exist. And that's where we can then start to shift perceptions, which will enable us to get the structures that we need to then get the results that we need.
So on that topic of challenging narratives, and I'm paraphrasing now, but in part 3 of your series, you argue that a belief in a certain myth about money, what Stephanie Kelton would call a deficit myth, you talk about how most people internalizing that myth is the big reason that the public and the media and the mainstream economists and the policymakers are all trapped in this growth paradigm. What would you say in particular is that myth or myths, and what's the truth?
So, I mean, obviously, you've had many MMT experts on here, so who can talk, I think, better to the deficit myth. For me, the myth about money, and I think why MMT has been so important in this narrative shift that we need, and why I also integrate it in the work that I'm doing, is that it tells us how money is actually created, that it is political, right? And that it comes from states producing money either when they pass a budget or by giving banks a license to create loans. It doesn't come from tax receipts. And that for me is one of the fundamental myths that we need to challenge if we are to shift to a sufficiency type economy. Because that idea that we need to get the taxes first, we need to get the growth first, to get the taxes first, keeps us locked in this kind of continual feedback loop where we never get the policies we need. And so to kind of break that down, if you think that we first of all need to get the growth in order to get the taxes and to get the jobs, we're then going to prioritise policies that we think are going to give us the growth first. And we're going to also prioritise policies that are going to benefit, say, the private sector, for example, the public sector, because we think that the public sector can't run a deficit. So we need to have a small state and a big private sector. But then that in turn leads to policies that are often detrimental to the common good. It leads to lowering tax rates often. It leads to actually counterproductive measures. It leads to lowering regulations. So we can see this very clearly in the UK right now, where Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves are funneling money into speculative carbon capture projects, which may be ineffective, which will require a lot of energy, a lot of resources, and do nothing to structurally change the energy system in the economy, rather than, say, giving people money to insulate their lofts, insulate their homes, or be able to ride a bike to work rather than take the car. So we then get stuck in this system. If we think that we need to rely first on the taxes, we get stuck in this system where we are always prioritising the private versus the public, and we're also ignoring care, the fundamental basis of our economy as well. So we're not investing in that. And maybe just one other thing on the taxpayers' money. I've been saying a lot, I would love to see more collaboration between MMT economists and feminist economists. I mentioned care. If we believe that our main contribution to society is paying our taxes, then what was the contribution of my mother who was a housewife? And we are sort of allowing rich people or wealthier people to say, well, I'm paying my taxes. I get this actually all the time in my work. I earn a lot less than I used to when I was a consultant for some of these big corporations, but I would argue I'm doing a lot more for society. I'm helping hopefully to reduce a lot of these environmental harms and these social harms in the work that I'm doing, but I'm not contributing with my taxes. So again, that's a fundamental narrative that needs to shift. And when we have the MMT component, I think that is very helpful.
Katie, I love what you're saying. I agree. I think we should collaborate more with feminist economics, as myself starting to get stuck into it, but I admit I should read more. Who would you recommend as the key kind of seminal feminist economists for an MMTA to get started?
So I am also just kind of getting myself into the work. So I guess I've been working more with more recent feminist economists. So actually there's an economist here in Austria called Karina Dengler. She's working actually at the between sort of post-growth and feminist economists, foundational economy. In the UK, there are people like Anna Kutz. In the US, Juliet Shore, who are working on promoting, for example, like a major climate hack is shorter working weeks. So I think those are maybe some people to get started with. But yeah, I'm also not an expert in that. But yeah, I fundamentally agree that we need to listen more. And I mentioned in my essays as well that feminist economists, because they are so critical of the current paradigm that we've been in, they've often been heard least. And that's another reason why my knowledge is so poor on this. Like, you're least likely to be presented with feminist perspectives in a mainstream economics degree, which is crazy when you think about it, because economists say themselves, they know that they struggle to get women to study economics, and yet they don't bring in the voices.
Yeah, so these radical people are saying that markets don't always price things accurately. They seem to value the wrong things just out of thin air.
Yeah, or the marginal product, right? The marginal product of labour is simply what I put in. I mean, you think about what you get paid to do care work, it simply doesn't stack up.
Yeah, to me, this is where MMT fits into this, because it's focused on resources rather than money. So the government issues the currency, it can't run out, it can afford to buy anything for sale priced in its own currency without operational limits, to be technical. But if you do the cost benefit analysis of, say, how much would a city save? And I know you kind of did this, Katie. If you do the cost benefit analysis of how much would a city save in monetary terms by paying to insulate all the homes in the city in terms of lower heating bills, you might go, well, the city stands to make a monetary loss, therefore we can't sign off on this. Whereas if you take the MMT approach, the post-Keynesian idea, anything we can physically do, we can monetarily afford, you do it. And then you get a city that's consuming fewer resources and producing lower emissions and a long run benefit.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I know that you did that monetary cost benefit analysis of insulating homes in Glasgow, I think, at one point.
Yeah, that was from my master's study. Yeah, that was, my first sort of taste of this kind of approach by economists. And it kind of comes back to, again, the methodology of sort of mainstream orthodox economics, where, we only count that which can be measured. And it's very hard to count the social and ecological benefits in monetary terms. And so if you can't, they sort of get overlooked by these models. And that was the frustration that I had, beyond the sort of ethical concept that you can somehow play one off the other and come to some kind of optimum.
Okay, that's enough of problems. So in your fourth and final essay, you lay out how economics as a discipline got into the state it's in today before you deal with the potential solutions. But can you walk us briefly through the feedback loops that have gotten set up in the system called mainstream economics? Can you walk us through that in terms of how economics got captured, or who or what captured it?
I will try my best. As I said, this was an initial exploration, and I'm actually very happy to hear feedback also maybe from any listeners. So I've put this all out in the public domain, and I tried to create a systems dynamics, a systems map of the various forces that are kind of working to uphold the status quo that we have right now in the discipline of economics. And maybe I should just say, to start with, I did this because I was teaching for several years. I was teaching on a climate fellowship, so to help people understand the climate crisis and figure out what they could do. So it was a kind of a boot camp for people kind of mid-career. And I was teaching the economics module, and I was able to bring in some of these alternative concepts. I was talking about post-growth, donut economics, well-being economics, also modern monetary theory. And I would get, without a doubt, 9 out of 10 people would ask, where can I learn more about this? And maybe also, why are more people not working on it? And I realized that actually we have a communication, which is, I think, for me, one of the leverage points. We have a communication job to explain how this system is upheld, because many people don't realize that the economics that is being taught today, it's not because it's taken the usual route of science where you're sort of continually trying to improve your understanding of the world and how it works and how economies work. That's not how economics works. What happened is that economics was essentially, it was on that route. There was a time when economics in the classical era, when you had people like Karl Marx and Adam Smith and different ideas of how our economies worked and the forces within them, you kind of had this play off ideas, but that increasingly narrowed over time. And a particular key point, and other people have written a lot more about this, like Naomi Oreskes and Kate Rayworth and George Monbiot also recently, on the kind of the neoliberal capture that happened in the post-war era when you had the establishment of the Mont Pelerin Society in the Swiss Alps, these neoliberal thinkers like Friedrich von Hayek, like Milton Friedman, who were coming together basically to kind of create a counter movement to the kind of Keynesian economics that we had in the post-war era, the kind of big state, also capitalist, still a growth-based economy, but with a very large state and a lot of redistribution happening and a lot of public services being funded. And sort of the neoliberal view of it should be each to their own, a small state, prioritization of business, of the private sector, of private property and so on. And it was heavily supported. And I think this is where Naomi Oreskes' work, so The Big Myth, I can highly recommend everyone to read that book, written with her colleague Eric Conway, on how that movement was heavily funded by business interests. People who were concerned that this big state, this high tax, high spend economies, high public spend economies were bad for business. And so they actually helped get these thinkers into key positions in universities, in particular the Chicago School. It's often talked about the Chicago School, but the Chicago School is often kind of talked about as like a kind of lone neoliberal entity, but that's only part of it. What happened was, because these institutions were so influential and because these thinkers were heavily sponsored, Friedrich von Hayek's book was famously made into a kind of digestible version for the Reader's Digest, The Road to Serfdom. These ideas, they really got into also the economic theory. And then what happened is that the journals, there's a phenomenon called the tyranny of the top 5 in economics. So if you want to advance your career in economics, you need to get your work published in one of the top 5 journals, ideally. Otherwise, you're not sort of seen as having made it. So I didn't make it, unfortunately. If you do, you're going to have to then produce research that kind of fits with this mental model, this idea of how the economy should work, kind of in service not to life and the common good, but in service essentially to profit, efficiency, producing as much wealth as possible and externalizing or shifting the social and ecological costs. So that's kind of where it started. That's where economics kind of turned. So I tried to sort of map that history. So you had this kind of takeover of a neoliberal ideology, not necessarily grounded in science, more of and I think Steve Keen has been very helpful in his work in debunking economics and the work that in his, I think it's his Substack where he's publishing his new book, that it's not that it was a better way of understanding the world, it's more an ideal of how our economies could work, just a very narrow ideal from a very narrow group of these more selfish, profit-oriented individuals. And that is what infiltrated our understanding of economics. And so once you've got that ideology kind of as the basis of what is getting taught, and then you've got a system where in order to progress as an academic, you must also produce the same kind of work to get into those journals. Then you start to create a feedback loop. So I've tried to sketch this. So you have a feedback loop in economics where it's reproducing itself. And then on top of that, then that starts to then influence the policies that we get. And we can take the example with climate economics, with Nordhaus. If all of the research coming out of economics is that climate is a problem to be optimized, that we pay for when we're rich enough, all we need is a very small carbon tax, if that's all the science is producing, then that's all the decision makers will hear. So then you start to get this feedback loop in policies, and then that starts to influence our institutions. So when I wanted to become a government economist and I failed to do so, I turned up at my interview and I didn't have enough maths. I didn't have these models that are kind of grounded in this very linear reductionist view of the world, because that is what is being taught and what's expected. So you have this whole series of feedback loops, and that also feeds into the public narrative. That also feeds into media. So now we're back to the narratives and the reasons why we don't have MMT. So there's these series of feedback loops. And another, I would say, final feedback loop, which I think is actually important and important for other people to know, or so maybe within that, I should say as well, I talk about how over time, the curriculum has narrowed and narrowed and narrowed. So we've had, because of this reinforcing feedback loop of academics only sort of reproducing what the kind of neoliberal ideology wants of them, you've had a reduction in the variety of theories that are taught. You've had a complete kind of disappearance in the history of economic thought. So new economists that turn up today to study economics are not even taught how their science has developed. They're taught, as you referred to, Patricia, at the beginning in the Gregory Mankiw book, hi, here's the economy, it's the market, that's the best way to do things. Just learn the mathematical models and you'll be fine. And so finally, what it creates is a groupthink. It creates this groupthink and these models that are increasingly untethered to the real world, but a culture within economics that can, as I say, that cannot communicate with the rest of science because they think that what they're doing is good because no one is telling them any different, because they're getting their papers published, because they're getting the peer review, because they're getting the Nobel Prizes, because they're getting the high top positions in the Ivy Leagues. And that's why they have a crisis where they're not able to get enough women, because a lot of women intuitively don't, I've struggled with a lot of these very abstract theories as well, the very individualistic theories. They have a problem with people who come from the working class. They have a problem with people from different backgrounds, from different racial backgrounds, not from the global north. And that also feeds in. So when you don't have that critical outside view, again, that feeds into the theories. And that's why we also continue to have economic policy positions coming out of research that are incapable of meeting our needs because they don't allow for any critical review of what they're doing. It's all very much internalized in these very tight reproducing feedback loops.
So in terms of solutions, your last essay in the series is entitled Leverage Points for Reclaiming Economics. What are some of those leverage points?
Yeah, so what I tried to do was I tried to use the work of Donella Meadows again. She wrote a famous paper several years before she died called Leverage Points, Places to Intervene in the System. And these are the places where small actions can kind of produce big effects. And so what I hope to do, and this is, again, I want to emphasize, this is a first attempt. I'm looking to expand this analysis. I'm very open to feedback and criticism. Also, anyone who might want to work on looking and investigating other leverage points. But the higher up the leverage points, so not the sort of the tangible leverage points, but the ones related to like information and how we perceive things, those are the high points of leverage. So I start with information flows. So that's a key leverage point that Donella Meadows put forward. And within that, what I emphasize is that there's a lot of talk that our economies are not working well, but I think there's not enough understanding of what I'm trying to put out in my essays, which is how we got to this place and why we're stuck. So I think anything we can do in these kind of forums, in other podcasts, in other media to help people understand the problems with mainstream economics and why we're stuck is a really key point of leverage. So I talk about potentially movements or getting people like Stephanie Kelton or Kate Raworth to get a column in this New York Times in the same way that we had Paul Krugman for 20 years, or the Economist subscribers. The Economist has never written an article about the planetary boundaries. Get the subscribers of the Economist to push the Economist there. You have Finding the Money and other documentaries that have been really crucial. So anything we can do to help increase the public understanding would be one key leverage point.
I like that also in your essay, and this is like thinking about saving ink as well, in a small way. You say The Economist should be entitled An Economist.
Yes, I agree. A change.org petition from Economist subscribers, because that would really push things, not coming from the outside, because again, we've got this issue with groupthink and a kind of them and us culture. If the subscribers of The Economist were to demand better from the magazine, then I think we can maybe start to shift things. Yeah, so information flows is really important. If we can even just work there, I think we'll have done a lot. The rules of the system, so as we get up the higher points of leverage, we get into the really structural parts of the system. And so changing the rules is a really fundamental point of leverage. And we talked earlier about, could we get a Hippocratic oath for economics? I don't know. Can we create a movement around that? These are some ideas. Curriculum changes are really critical. And I also want to highlight the work of Rethinking Economics, the kind of student-led activist group that are trying to change curriculum, get donut economics into the curriculum, get history of economic thought back into the curriculum. It's hard work, but as another leverage point, one that I think is really interesting is even going the step before and looking at the school level. And there's a great initiative called Regenerative Economics for high schools. They're creating an open source textbook. It's based on donut economics, and they've already got some schools using that in schools. And this is important because I think the lesson from systems thinking is it doesn't need to be an everywhere at once change. It can happen in a few spots, and that is enough to tip things. Because once you're starting to teach school children differently about economics, then why should we have central banks working with models that don't integrate the environment, or the Government Economic Service, or top professors in the Ivy League? So even those changes have potential for really high leverage. So I would recommend, if anyone is involved in teaching, to check out some of those initiatives. And then if we can get at the university level differences, curricula could be one, but what I think is an also maybe less explored option is we don't need to work within the economics departments. They're going to be probably the last to change. That doesn't mean that other departments couldn't integrate some of these ideas. We're seeing a shift anyway to more interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary degrees. I mentioned a couple of examples in my essays. There's a really great heterodox program in Vienna. There's the Centre for Heterodox Economics that Clara Matai is now heading in the University of Tulsa. You've had Stephen Hale on from University of Torrance and their great master's programs. But I think potentially there's also beyond even economics, there's potential to bring these ideas in elsewhere. And I guess the very high points or leverage is then talking about what economics is for. And this really gets to like the heart of where we need to change. And it's not about efficiency. And I think here, I probably just mentioned one example is the essay. You may have read the blog essay by Angus Deaton, famous economist, describes himself as a mainstream economist, has also won the Nobel Prize, but eventually calling out his discipline for saying exactly that. I mean, we seem to have developed a science where the purpose is to funnel money up to the rich and extract from everyone else. We need to have that conversation. So I would say the highest leverage point is getting more people like Angus Deaton to speak out.
Got it. I wanted to emphasize this thing that you channel in from Donella Meadows' leverage point essay. The idea is, yes, always be pointing out gaps and inconsistencies in neoclassical models, but at the same time, do as much as possible to connect the anomalies to the paradigm that created them, which is the bigger problem. At the end of the day, the paradigm is the cause of the illness and the flawed models are the symptoms. That's what I got from thinking about it as a hierarchical structure. But before we go, I just wanted to say I really liked the impact page you shared from the Rethinking Economics site, or you linked to it in your essay, because there's a big list of wins there where their activism's led to positive changes in economics teaching. So that's a shot in the arm for anybody losing faith in economic activism. I'll share that in the show notes.
Yeah, definitely. And also encourage people to look at how you can support them, because student-led groups are notoriously hard to keep going. And I think they've achieved a lot. So they could benefit, I'm sure, from other people, from alumni, for example, coming in and saying, yeah, we should be teaching economics differently. So yeah, really important example.
Great stuff. So before we wrap up, Katy, can you tell our listeners about what you've got coming up? I think you've got some in-person workshops in Berlin and Vienna. Is that right?
Yeah, so a couple of things. And yeah, thank you for asking. And thanks again for having me on. One of the initiatives that I've set up is called the Regenerative Economy Lab. And I'm trying to work with people from all different backgrounds to help them grasp some of these concepts and then find ways that they can help to tip some of these leverage points. So yeah, we've got workshops coming up in Berlin this summer, later in Vienna. We just had one this weekend. So that's one of the things that I'm working on. As I mentioned as well, I'm hoping that I'm going to turn this series of essays into a podcast, like a documentary series similar to what we did with the Limits to Growth, because I would love to also bring the voices out and the examples of the many people that are actually working to try to change economics education. So I'm also happy if people have ideas for that and want to reach out. And then I would maybe also just say that if anyone is listening in Vienna, we've got the Beyond Growth Forum coming up on the 13th of June. So we're going to be talking about all these different ways to change the system. And this is really, we're part of a growing movement. There's also other Beyond Growth conferences happening across Europe. So yeah, I'm happy to link that. And if anyone wants to find out more, I'm happy to reach out.
Great stuff. That's a great place to leave it. We've been speaking to recovered economist and educator Katy Shields. I'll link to Katy's fantastic writing, podcasts, and in-person workshops in the show notes for this episode. If you want to take your understanding of MMT and real-world economics, including ecological economics, to the next level, Modern Money Lab run online graduate and postgraduate courses taught by the best lecturers in the world in their respective fields. And don't forget, for our UK listeners, Modern Money Lab's Professor Stephen Hale will be teaching 2 workshops in London on the last 2 weekends in June, aimed at, in a nutshell, ending austerity and the economic myths that underpin it. There are prices to suit every pocket for these seminars, including free, so do check out the link in the show notes. These weekends are being run by Modern Money Lab UK, who will also be running a conference in Bristol on the 12th and 13th of September 2025, entitled Anything We Can Actually Do, We Can Afford. So I'll link to modernmoneylab.org.uk in the show notes. Whereas ever, for our Patreon subscribers, there'll be a link to all of our patron-only episodes. Lots of extras there for you to unlock. But for now, thanks so much for joining us today on the MMT podcast, Katy Shields.
Thank you.
That was the MMT Podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Don't forget, you can support the show through Patreon, starting at $1 a month and get access to patron-only episodes. You can do that by going to patreon.com/MMT Podcast. You can also find me on Twitter at MMT Podcast, and you can find Patricia on Twitter at Patricia N. Pino, and you can email us at mmtpodcast@outlook.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope to hear from you.